War of the Worlds Martian invasion? Hoax. Surgeon's photo of Nessie? Hoax. Alien autopsy? Hoax. Some hoaxes are pretty easy to spot, but the most studied artifact in history that people have been calling a hoax for 700 years is proving to be a tougher nut to crack. Welcome to the In-Between. I'm Carol Ann, and we are talking about a simple piece of cloth bearing the image of a man that no scientist has been able to figure out how it got there. We are diving deep into the Shroud of Turin. Just a little disclaimer right off the top that it is not my intention to ruffle any feathers with this topic. Like any other strange and mysterious topic on this channel, my only goal is to shed light on the weirdness in this world. So whatever side of the fence you're on, just be nice to each other down in the comment section. Also, some people say Turin, others say Turin.
Potato, patata, tomato.
I watched one shroud expert say it both ways in the same interview, so I'm just going to default to Turin. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Shroud of Turin, it's a roughly 14.5 foot by 3.5 foot piece of flax linen cloth with an imprint of the front and back of a naked man that is venerated by millions of Christians around the world as the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Well, that's not controversial or anything. It's not like proving or disproving the authenticity of this one piece of cloth has ramifications for all of humanity or anything. But regardless of whether you think the shroud is the real deal or not, there's no denying that this particular length of cloth exhibits some seriously weird and mysterious properties. So what do we know about the shroud? Well, there are accounts of a folded cloth with an image imprinted on it being delivered to King Abgar of Edessa, which is now known as Şanlıurfa in modern Turkey, following Jesus' promise to him to send a disciple to heal him. Some people claim this imprinted cloth was the shroud. The legend says that as Abgar's descendants turned back to paganism, the bishop of Edessa hid the cloth in the city wall where it was uncovered centuries later. It was then sent to Constantinople as a holy relic of the Eastern Orthodox religion, where it was seized by members of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Some theorize that it made its way into the hands of the Knights Templar, who then brought it back to France, where it stays hidden until 1353. That's when it pops up for everyone to see in a little chapel in Liry, France. The feudal lord of the area that included Liry is a knight by the name of Geoffroy de Charny, who may or may not have had ties to the Knights Templar. Okay, so everything up to this point is pretty much conjecture. We have no proof of the history or what researchers call provenance of the shroud until this date of 1353. At this point, the shroud is displayed and purported to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus. All is well until about 1390, when the area bishop, Pierre d'Arcis, writes a letter to then anti-pope, when the French decided they wanted their own pope, Clement VII, saying, hey, we have this really big burial cloth here on display that people think was Jesus's. But I have a letter from the bishop before me that says that he found the guy who made it and the guy confessed to painting it. What do I do? Clement says, go ahead and keep showing it. Just make sure that you make it clear to everyone that it's a fake. So the shroud remains a relic of the chapel for a few more years until the granddaughter of Geoffroy de Charny, Marguerite de Charny, decides to take it. The people of Liry say, give it back. Marguerite says, make me, and then gives it to Louis, the Duke of Savoy. It stays in their family chapel in Chambéry. It survives a fire that leaves scorch marks from molten silver in several places until 1578, when the Savoy family decides to move to Turin, Italy, and bring the shroud with them, where it has lived ever since. It should be noted that in 1506, Pope Julius II does a 180 and gives the okay for the veneration of the shroud as a true relic of Jesus. Why he does this, or what information might he have had that led him to this about-face, nobody knows. In any case, the shroud remains the property of the Savoy family until 1983, when it is bequeathed to the Vatican by the last king of Italy, Umberto II, upon his death, but physically stays in the chapel that was built specifically for it in Turin. There, it would survive another fire in 1997. The shroud is now kept in a bulletproof glass case filled with argon gas to keep it from further deterioration. It is not on display every day. The last time it was on public display was 2015. But if you go to the chapel of the Holy Shroud within the Turin Cathedral, you can see the case where it is kept, just not the shroud itself. Now, this piece of cloth is pretty much treated as just a matter of faith, just like all of the supposed bits of the cross you find in churches everywhere, until an accidental discovery in 1898. For the occasion of the 400th birthday of the Turin Cathedral, the city planned a sacred art exhibition and arranged to have a guy named Secondo Pia, the local photography expert, shoot the first ever pictures of the shroud. When he goes back to his darkroom later that day, he gets the shock of his life. Instead of a mostly brown negative image of the mostly yellow piece of linen, his negative reveals not just a full face, but a full body full of visual detail that had never been seen before. Of course, tons of people said he either didn't know what the hell he was doing, or worse, that he faked it. Until another professional photographer named Giuseppe Henri also took photos of the shroud in 1931 and got the same result. The result of both of those photographs is the realization that when looking at the shroud, we are not looking at a positive image. We are looking at a negative image. The real image can only be seen when looking at the negative. And that negative showing the positive image is the iconic vision of the shroud that most people know today. Besides not knowing that he would be the first to photograph the face that many Christians believe is the face of Christ, Secondo Pia also did not know that he would inadvertently create a new branch of scientific study called syndenology, which is the name specifically for the scientific study of the shroud, the word synden being Greek for shroud. Scientists from a multitude of disciplines start theorizing about the origin of the shroud's image, but other than studying the photograph and its negative, there isn't really a lot they can do. The shroud is off limits. But by the 1960s, the Turin Archdiocese, who were its acting custodians at the time, they start to think, well, hey, maybe we should figure out the best way to preserve this thing. So they form an 11-member committee, some members of which are scientists who between 1969 and 1973 try to figure out what they need to do. And that's when the first fabric samples are taken. But things really get going in 1977 when the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, which is a 33-member, multidisciplinary team of scientists representing a multitude of countries and a multitude of religious beliefs, including mostly believers, but skeptics as well, is given 120 hours of access to the shroud to collect as much information as they can get. Rumor has it that the night before the testing was to begin, the scientists were gathered at the hotel bar, relishing their free trip to Italy, thinking it's going to take them all of a day to prove this thing is a hoax. Even the believers, but they are wrong. After a day, they're more stumped than ever. The scientists work in shifts to maximize every hour before the 120 hours is up. This includes tape samples and vacuum samples to collect trace evidence and every kind of photography you can imagine. The information gathered is then taken home to be analyzed. It takes them another 3 years to come out with a conclusion. What did they decide? They have no idea. In their final report, they say, We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. Of course, that is far from the end of the story. There are lots of disagreements over testing procedures and interpretation of the results, which certainly is not a big surprise given the diverse nature of the group. In the fall of 1987, the Vatican says, okay, let's try this again, and approves testing for the one test not performed by the STIRP team in 1978, radiocarbon dating. So in April of 1988, a small section of cloth from one of the shroud's corners is carefully cut away, divided into 3, and sent to 3 different carbon dating labs. The results rock the Christian world. The 3 labs announced in October of 88 that they have come to the conclusion that the date of the cloth falls in a range from 1260 to 1390 AD. Believers are heartbroken, skeptics are elated, and the news makes headlines around the world in lightning speed. As for the skeptics, and a lot of believers as well, that's where the story ends. But does it? Really? If you answered yes, then I know you are new to this channel, because on the in-between, there is always more to the story. Now, I'm going to throw out a caveat right now. There's no way to cover everything about the shroud. There are over 1,000 books and almost as many, if not more, research papers on all aspects of this topic from both believers and skeptics alike. So I cannot cover every bit of data, but instead I'm going to highlight the arguments that stuck out to me the most about the shroud research, both for and against its authenticity. I will lay out chips from both sides on the table, leaving you to decide for yourselves. But I will tell you right up front that I am leaving the one bit of information that blew my mind personally for last. So I'm going to take the elephant in the room, the nail in the coffin for the skeptics, the carbon dating. When you read the fine print, turns out it isn't as cut and dried as it sounds. Okay, crash course on radiocarbon dating. All living things on Earth contain carbon, both carbon-12 and carbon-14. Carbon-12 is stable. Carbon-14 is not and decays over time. When that organism is no longer living, the carbon-12 in their system stays the same, but the carbon-14 continues to decay into nitrogen. And after 5,730 years, only half of the original level of carbon-14 is still present. So by comparing the amount of carbon-14 still present in the test sample compared to the level of carbon-12, scientists can figure out how old it is. And this is the test that was performed on samples of the shroud. Scientists at Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology all independently tested samples of the cloth and came to a consensus that the cloth was produced between 1260 and 1390 AD. But as is often the case, the devil is in the details. Warning, you better get comfortable with your beverage of choice for this story. Carbon dating was not part of the test conducted by the STIRP team in 1978 because the Vatican would not allow any tests that would be destructive to the shroud, and carbon dating would have required a sample of the fabric. But after the STIRP team releases their conclusion of all of the tests they did run, they decide, well, why not see if we can do some more? So they submit a list of 26 more tests they want to run, carbon dating being on that list. Their proposal is approved by then Cardinal Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI. And many months of meetings and planning take place between the Vatican, several of the original STIRP members, some new scientists, and several carbon dating labs. From the get-go, there are issues in the group. The carbon dating people think there's really no reason to perform any of the other tests. Carbon dating would answer the only relevant question. The scientists think that the carbon daters are only interested in the fame and funding that they are bound to get, and the carbon daters think the scientists are just a bunch of religious zealots. Harry Gove, from the Radiocarbon Dating Laboratory at the University of Rochester, goes so far as to say this: almost without exception, there were people who honestly believe it's Christ's shroud. It's a well-known fact that scientists can produce whatever result they want. If you believe that passionately in something, you can steer the results. My God, we've all been guilty of that. In the end, the carbon daters win the day, and all other tests that the Vatican had approved are canceled with the exception of the carbon dating. Now, through these many months of planning, a protocol for how the carbon dating process would go down had been established. 7 different laboratories would do the testing. 2 different methods of carbon dating would be used: the old method that has an established track record, and the new method that hasn't been around as long but needs a much smaller sample. The test will be supervised and coordinated by Dr. Michael Tite of the British Museum. Samples of the shroud will be taken from at least 3 different spots. The STRP team, who practically know every fiber of the shroud already, will be the ones to decide where the samples will come from and do the cutting. Each laboratory will test 3 samples, 1 of the shroud and 2 other control samples of different ages. Only the test supervisor will know the age of the control samples, so he can check the accuracy of each laboratory's dating process. It's a blind test. The samples are all going to look alike, so that laboratories running the tests won't be able to tell which sample is the shroud and which are the controls. The laboratories are to maintain strict secrecy, not tell anybody about the results except anyone authorized by the British Museum. All the labs will do the tests at the same time and without exchanging information. 3 institutions, the British Museum, the Meteorological Institute of Turin, and the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, will be the ones to analyze the results. And finally, after the results have been analyzed, the analyzers will meet with the radiocarbon labs to make sure that they all are in agreement, and then communicate those results to the Vatican. That seems pretty thorough to me, but it takes about a hot minute for things to start unraveling. First, the STRP guys are suddenly cut out of the loop. Someone else is going to choose the locations and cut the samples. Then, the Vatican decides it's only going to be 1 sample instead of 3. Then they decide to use only 3 labs instead of 7. Of which the University of Rochester is not one. Sorry, Harry. And they're all going to use the newer, less established of the 2 carbon dating methods. Well, aren't we off to a great start? But on April 21st, 1988, test supervisor Michael Tite, people from the Catholic Church, people from the 3 carbon dating laboratories, which, if you remember, end up being Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, photographers, and a camera crew who are there to document the entire operation, all gather at the Turin Cathedral. 2 textile specialists are chosen to decide from where on the shroud the sample should be taken. One of those experts points to the bloodstain caused by the wound in the side and asks, "What's that large brown patch?" Eventually, they decide to cut a piece from the corner, like the corner that has been grabbed and stretched by probably dozens of different people over the years of exhibitions. The corner that is also pretty close to the area that's been burned away by the fire in 1532 and stained by the water used to put out that fire, which most likely left nice little deposits of dust, blood, and other contaminants. The textile experts pick the worst possible area. Okay, so the sample is cut and divided into 3 roughly equal pieces, 1 for each lab. Michael Tite then brings out the control samples, which have a different weave pattern. But instead of unraveling all of the samples, he leaves them as is, meaning it is now very easy to figure out which one is from the shroud. There goes the blind testing protocol. The samples are weighed and put into numbered metal cylinders, which will go to the 3 testing labs. Oh, and remember that camera crew hired to film the whole thing? They don't film this part, so there's no way to verify which samples go into which containers. Not to mention that Michael Tite decides at the last minute to throw in a 4th sample, some thread from a cape from St. Louis of Anjou, which is known to be dated to the 13th century. They don't have metal cylinders for the extra samples, so they just get put into envelopes. Each lab is given their metal cylinders and their envelope and are asked to sign a receipt. The receipt lists the ages of the control samples. So now they don't even have to bother looking at the weave to figure out which sample is the shroud. It's just written right there for them. This is like the Three Stooges convention. But it gets even better. The weights of the samples the labs receive don't all match the recorded weights of the samples that were taken from the shroud. They were supposed to all perform the test at the same time, but Arizona does theirs in May, Zurich in June, and Oxford does theirs in July. At first, they seem to do a decent job of sticking to the secrecy protocol and reject a request from the Vatican to send one of their people to watch. But Zurich thinks it's perfectly reasonable to let in an entire BBC documentary crew. And remember our friend Harry from the University of Rochester? Well, he manages to twist the arm of someone in the Arizona lab to let him watch the process as long as he signs a non-disclosure agreement. Harry and his assistant have made a bet for a pair of cowboy boots on the outcome of the tests. The assistant thinks the results will be from the time of Christ, but Harry thinks it's going to come back as dating to medieval times. The ink is not even dry on the paper with the results before Harry breaks his NDA by phoning his assistant to claim his shiny new boots. In Oxford, 2 weeks before the results are announced to even the church, a book entitled The Shroud Unmasked, Discovery of the Greatest Forgery of All Time, is already on the presses. When confronted about this breach of secrecy protocol, the guy in charge of the Oxford lab, Professor Edward Thomas Hall, says, "I think it was a hopeless prospect to keep the results secret. You couldn't with the best will in the world." Okay, so the tests are completed and given to Michael Tite at the British Museum, but no one else. The other 2 institutions who are also supposed to analyze the data are completely cut out of the process. The statistical analysis is completed by the people from the British Museum under the watchful eye of Michael Tite, and the results are announced at a press conference including both Professor Hall and Michael Tite in October of 1988, with Professor Hall not mincing words about his thoughts on the matter, stating, "There was a multi-million-pound business in making forgeries during the 14th century. Someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it. Some people may continue to fight for the authenticity of the shroud, like the Flat Earth Society, but this settles it all as far as we are concerned." Nice exclamation point. While I'm not going to go deep into the data that was published to back up their conclusion, since that's way above my pay grade, I will highlight just one little tidbit. When doing these kinds of statistical analyses, statisticians come up with what's called the significance level. That's a measure of the reliability of the results, so the higher, the better. The British Museum doesn't actually publish that number, but using their own published data, that significance level for the Shroud's test comes out to 4.176, which they then round up to 5, which is important because anything under 5 is written off as completely unreliable. But it gets worse. Despite numerous requests over the years, they never give up the original data. That is, until a French lawyer finally cuts through the red tape with the British version of our Freedom of Information Act request and gets all of the data in 2017. Turns out that the labs actually performed more tests than what was reported. And when you add in those test results to the pool, the results get even less reliable. Kind of makes that quote from Harry Gove that it's a well-known fact that scientists can produce whatever result they want even more interesting, doesn't it? Now, with all of that dirty laundry being aired and throwing some serious shade on the validity of the carbon dating results, it still begs the question, why don't the results point back to the 1st century? Well, there are a multitude of theories out there that talk about various different kinds of contamination that could be taking place. Excessive handling, excess carbon deposits from the fire, or even laboratory cleaning procedures of the sample before testing. But one American couple, Joseph Marino and Sue Benford, not scientists, just shroud hobbyists, managed to find something no one else has. Looking at the pictures of the shroud, they noticed that the weave pattern in the area where the samples were cut was ever so slightly misaligned from the rest of the cloth. Following their hunch, they sent the pictures to 3 textile experts who all say, "Yup, that's a reweave." So the couple publishes their research with their conclusion being that the area that the samples came from is an area that was repaired from the fire damage. The response from the scientific community? Amateurs. Enter a guy named Ray Rogers, an original member of the STRP team who has pretty much had it up to here with crazy shroud theories, who reads about this new patch area theory and blows a gasket. He sets out on a mission to prove them wrong, but figures out they're right. Taking a close look at the samples, he discovers fibers that are cotton, which the shroud is made of flax. And these fibers are dyed, which the main part of the shroud is not. So he confirms that the area was rewoven with thread at least partially containing cotton fiber and then dyed to make it match in color to the rest of the cloth. Hats off to the nuns in 1532 who did their job so well that the repair was all but invisible to the naked eye. Roger then goes back and looks at the ultraviolet pictures taken by his team in 1978, and there it is. That area of the cloth does not fluoresce in the same way. It's not the same cloth. And of course, that's exactly where the sample was taken. Okay, I know that was a long way to go to get here, but I thought it was important to deflate that elephant and show that the carbon dating argument isn't necessarily the end-all, be-all mic drop that it has been portrayed as, to make room for different information. So now that we have some mental space, let's look at some of the other arguments. And just so you know, after looking at all of this stuff, I am still on the fence. So if I sound like I'm fighting for one side or the other, it's only because I like to play devil's advocate and I don't like it when people tell me what to think. So when I approach a topic like this one, I usually go to Wikipedia and check out what they have to say, just to get a basic lay of the land. I know, Wikipedia. But then I start clicking outside links and going down rabbit holes from there. And that's exactly what I did for the Shroud as well. And thank God I did. If you just read what Wikipedia says, in my humble opinion, they go out of their way to only talk about the aspects of this mystery that they can say have been debunked. But the rabbit holes actually led me to a place that's just the opposite. Okay, so there are so many disparate areas to cover that I don't really know where to start. So let's just start with the cloth itself. It's made of woven flax, very common for the era. Remember, if this is the actual burial cloth of Jesus, we're talking about the early 1st century, biblically speaking, 33 AD. It is woven in what is called a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern. Some historians say that particular pattern was not available at the time and only surfaced in medieval times. However, according to Stephen E. Jones of the SHROUD of Turin blogspot, who admits that there are no samples of herringbone twill weave in linen yet known from the 1st century or earlier, there are examples of that same weave pattern in silk and wool from the 3rd century in Syria and Britain, and in wool in the early 2nd century from the Roman fort of Crocodilo in Egypt's eastern desert. So we know it's not just a medieval times thing. And if they're making it in Egypt to the south and in Syria to the north, and Jerusalem is pretty much a big trading hub, does it seem logical that some of that fabric could have made its way to market there? But wouldn't a piece of cloth that old have disintegrated by now? Not necessarily. The Tarkhan dress, named for the Tarkhan cemetery in Cairo, Egypt, where it was found in 1913, is an over 5,000-year-old woven linen garment that is the world's oldest piece of woven clothing. Another interesting tidbit is that at the beginning, I said the cloth was roughly 14.5 by 3.5 feet. Well, more accurately, it's 14.3 by 3.6 feet. Kind of a random number, right? Nope. Back in those trading markets of the early 1st century, the international standard unit of length was the Assyrian standard cubit, which measures somewhere between 21.4 and 21.6 inches. The shroud's odd measurements turn out to be exactly 2 by 8 Assyrian standard cubits. Huh! Now, make no mistake, this would have been a very expensive piece of fabric. But according to the Bible, Jesus' body was claimed and taken care of by 2 very wealthy benefactors, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who would easily have had the means to buy that piece of fabric. Now, let's look at this from the medieval forgery side of the coin. According to our man, Professor Hall, there were tons of people in medieval times looking to make a quick buck by forging religious artifacts. But that particular piece of fabric was rare in medieval times as well, so would still have been expensive. Why would a forger spend a good chunk of his future margin on expensive fabric when no one's going to be the wiser anyway? Not to mention that the Assyrian standard cubit was not discovered to be the standard until the 19th century, and it never mentions in the Bible how big the shroud was. So how would a forger know how big to make the cloth? All right, let's leave that tidbit to the side and talk about what is on the cloth. The entire length of the cloth contains the front and back images of a man measuring somewhere between 5'7" and 6'2", as if the man was laid down on the cloth and the rest of the cloth was brought up over his head to cover his front side. The image itself seems to come from excessive yellowing of the fabric. In addition, there are scorch marks and holes that are documented to have come from the 1532 fire, and dark reddish and brown stains that look an awful lot like bloodstains. Now, obviously, people have been studying this for a while, but the study gets more and more intense as technology improves. The invention of photography brought us those stunning negative images with details that can't be seen with the naked eye. And something called the VP8 analyzer brought us 3D. The VP8 analyzer is a computer developed in the early 70s that can assign 3D value to the brightness range of a photo. I have no idea what it was actually developed for, but when you show it a regular old photo, you get a result something like this. Or this. But when you show it the negative of the shroud, you get an almost complete 3D image of the face imprinted on the shroud. And it is this image, produced around 1976, that is responsible for the inception of the Shroud of Turin research project. STRP. So the shroud is not a picture, because a picture does not contain enough brightness information to construct a full 3D image. But according to the STRP guys, it's also not a painting. No evidence of brushstrokes or residue of either inks or dyes can be found on the cloth. Well, almost none. One of the original STRP members, Walter McCrone, whose work in forensic chemical analysis helped discover the forgery of the famous Vinland map, begged to differ. His analysis from particles taken from some of the 32 sticky tape samples taken from the shroud in the 1978 testing fest showed that the image imprint was painted with a diluted mixture of iron oxide and gelatin, while the blood stains were painted with mercury sulfide and gelatin. He did not see any signs of blood proteins in the samples. However, he was pretty much alone in his analysis. Other members of the team said they absolutely could identify signs of blood. McCrone said, "You don't see what I see because you don't know what you're looking for, and your instruments aren't as good as mine." Eventually, McCrone gave back all of his sticky tape samples and quit the STRP team, but went on to write articles and give lectures on his pigment theory. Now, I'm not even going to pretend to know the intricacies of his arguments, but considering that blood samples were eventually collected and typed as being AB, I'm not sure how we can stay with the determination that it's paint and not blood. Now, the other STRP guys weren't saying that they didn't see any signs of pigment on the cloth, just not enough to constitute the image being a painting. Their hypothesis for there being pigment at all is that in medieval times, replicas of holy relics were often copied. The artist would set up next to the original and copy it, and then touch the copy to the original with the belief that the holiness of the original would transfer to the copy. So if painters were rubbing their copies onto the shroud, it makes sense that some pigment would be transferred. So if you believe the STRP group that the shroud is not painted, let's revisit that confession that Bishop Pierre Darcis's predecessor got from the artist. If the confession says he painted it, and we know it wasn't painted, to what exactly would he have been confessing? Might be important to keep in mind that
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
the medieval Inquisition had only ended less than 100 years before the supposed confession. The medieval Inquisition was focused mainly in France, where this confession was given and was carried out by the local bishops. You think people were inclined to say no to the bishop? No. I'm sure they would have confessed to anything. Not to mention that confessing to creating a forgery of a holy relic had to have some serious consequences. But there's nothing about the confessor or any punishment given in church records. All right, let's get back to the blood. The blood that is on the shroud can't be proven to be or not be Jesus' blood, since we have no DNA comparison sample. But numerous samples were DNA typed. The results were kind of all over the board. There are various samples of pollen from pretty much everywhere, and numerous different people also pretty much from everywhere. They even found some animal DNA, namely from a southern gray shrike, which is a bird that hangs out around southern Europe and northern Africa and the Near East. And the one that I find very interesting is DNA from a marine worm found only in the northern Pacific Ocean. That's a little random. At one point, The claim was made that pollen and limestone were both found that are specific to the Jerusalem region, but there have been a few papers released since then questioning the methodology of those studies, so we're not going to include that information here. But then again, who am I kidding? I think every paper written about this topic, no matter what side it's been on, has been refuted by somebody. I love it! It's like a cage match for nerds. Anyway, up to this point, the evidence has been pretty circumstantial to varying degrees. And without going all holy Bible on you, there's even more. Traces of the myrrh and aloe said to have been used in his burial have been found on the shroud. The legs of the man on the shroud were not broken, as is usually the case for those who are crucified. Blood patterns on the shoulders and back line up with the story of Jesus carrying the crossbeam to his crucifixion site. Bloodstains on the wrist and feet correlate with actual crucifixion practice, with nails going through the wrists instead of through the hands, as is common in medieval art depictions. The wounds sustained by the man on the shroud completely align with biblical accounts, and forensic blood flow analysts say all the blood flow patterns on the cloth match the descriptions given of the last hours of Jesus' life. The crucifixion of Jesus is said to have been particularly brutal as far as crucifixions go, and the man on the cloth looks like he has been through the ringer. His eye looks almost like it's swollen shut. His nose looks to be broken, and the streaks of 120 scourge marks cover his entire body. He has a wound on his right side where it is said that a Roman soldier pierced it with a lance. He has blood trickling down his head where it is said a soldier placed a crown of thorns. The man on the cloth matches the biblical stories to a T. Now, to give the skeptics their due, the image on the shroud does have some issues. The arms and the fingers on the hand are too long. The proportions of the face aren't quite right, and the placement of his arms seems very unnatural for a person laying in a prone position. Although, by the time that he is put into the tomb, rigor mortis would have been setting in, so who knows how that would affect his position. And there are plenty of other tidbits, like coins on his eyes and flowers around his head, that I honestly can't see, but feel free to jump down that rabbit hole as well. So up to this point, we've been kind of nibbling around the edges, but we are finally at the point where we can really dig into the heart of the arguments that put this whole affair on my weirdness radar. First, let's talk about something I had never even heard of. My Catholic family is not going to like hearing that. Until I started researching the shroud. The Sudarium of Oviedo. Sudarium being the word for the traditional Jewish burial headcloth, and Oviedo being the town in Spain where the cloth is said to be kept. So back in Jesus' day, Jewish law said that bodily fluids needed to be buried with the body. Once Jesus had died on the cross, someone would have wrapped a cloth around his head to make sure that none of those fluids were lost. The Sudarium is that cloth. Not to go too deep into the weeds, scientists have established exactly how this 34 by 21 inch cloth was wrapped on his head, and they've identified 70 points of similarity between the bloodstains on the Sudarium and those found on the Shroud of Turin. But the one that is the most interesting to me is a blood trickle on the forehead of the man on the shroud. Now, people way smarter than I have figured out exactly how the cloth was wrapped around the head and how each grouping of stains got there. And this forehead stain on the Sudarium is the exact same pattern as the blood trickle on the shroud. But even better is this little detail. Imagine you have a small amount of blood trickling slowly over time down your forehead. The edges will begin to dry, but the spot at the bottom of the trickle will stay wet the longest and form a little drop, right? Now imagine putting a cloth over your head. That cloth is going to soak up the wet blood at the end of the trickle and leave a clean spot, right? Well, the Sudarium shows a spot where blood was soaked up, and the matching wound on the shroud shows the clean spot. It's a little hard to see with the images available, but almost every photo I've seen, the middle of the blood drop at the end of the trickle is clean. Now, the reason the Sudarium is important to the shroud debate is because while the provenance for the shroud only goes back to the mid-14th century, the Sudarium can be dated back to 614 AD. So if the Sudarium and the shroud can be proven to come from the same event, that destroys the medieval forgery narrative. Also note that the Sudarium has the same dust mixture around the nose that was found in the corresponding nose area of the shroud, and the same blood type, AB. Now, AB blood is kind of rare in the rest of the world, with only about 4% of the population having it in the US. It's a little more common in the Middle East at about 5%. More common, but still only 5%. So what are the odds that two random ancient cloths would have bloodstains of the same AB blood type? 1 in 400, or 0.25%. Seriously? But let's go back to the shroud. Remember me saying that no one knows how the imprint of our shroud man got there? They know it's not paint. They know it's not dye. Well, turns out that they do know what makes the imprint, they just don't know how it happened. The imprint is formed by the yellowing of the flax fibers that make up the cloth. The yellowing is from rapid aging, so they just don't know why those areas would have aged any differently than the rest of the cloth. Another thing they do know is that the blood staining present on the shroud was there before the rapid aging of the yellowed areas, because the same changes to the fibers is not present in those areas. And the bloodstains go all the way through the cloth, like they were soaked up into the fibers. But the rapid aging effect is very superficial. It's only present on the very outer layer of the fibers. But the fibers that are yellow all the way around the circumference, not just the side facing out. And the yellowing is on a fiber by fiber basis. One fiber might be yellow while the next to it is not. And keep in mind, we are not talking about each thread. We are talking about each individual fiber that makes up each thread. Also, the staining on the shroud doesn't just contain blood. It contains blood serum. Anyone who's ever had a serious wound can tell you that even after it stops bleeding, it can still leak a clear fluid. That's blood serum. Well, some of the bloodstains on the cloth show an outline of this clear serum called a serum halo. And they can tell that it's actually blood serum by the way it fluoresces under a UV light. If they were just water stains, say from the fire, they wouldn't show up under UV light. Now, it's been shown that there are other liquids that also fluoresce the same way, but this puts the medieval forgery theory in trouble again. How would a 14th century forger know what liquids to use to create the correct UV fluorescence when UV is centuries from being a thing? Another interesting thing about the bloodstains is that they are very red for being that old. Blood usually darkens to either a dark brown or even black over time. This, of course, leads many people to say that the red color has to be paint. But testing of the blood showed a high bilirubin count, the same thing that causes the yellow skin that comes with jaundice. And bilirubin has a preservative effect, keeping blood from breaking down and turning that dark color. And recently, even more testing has confirmed the presence of high levels of creatinine and ferritin iron in the blood. Levels of bilirubin, ferritin iron, and creatinine in the blood are known to go through the roof in people under extreme duress experiencing muscle trauma and impaired kidney function, like someone would be if they were being tortured and beaten to a pulp. The latest testing to hit the news recently is some new testing done of the flax fibers that make up the cloth. The new test, called WAXIS, or Wide Angle X-ray Scattering, was performed by the Institute of Crystallography in Italy. The test is looking for a substance called vanillin, which is a natural part of the cellulose structure of the fiber. Turns out that vanillin decays at a predictable rate, so it's kind of like a carbon dating test using vanillin instead. Their testing shows that the vanillin levels in the shroud fibers match fibers from other burial shrouds known to have come from the Jewish uprising of Masada between 66 and 74 AD. Sounds like a slam dunk, right? Well, not exactly. To get to its current level of vanillin degradation, the cloth would have had to be kept at a temperature of about 72 degrees Fahrenheit with a relative humidity of roughly 55% for the first 13 centuries of its existence. Interesting. It's possible, but not likely. However, and this is fascinating to me, this same test also disproves the medieval forgery theory. To get to the level of vanillin depletion shown in the test, the shroud would have had to have been out in the sun in Mali, Africa, literally Timbuktu, for its entire 700-year existence, because that's the only place hot enough to age it that quickly. Now, I told you at the beginning of all of this that I was saving the best for last, and I am about to make good on that promise. I know this is going to blow your mind because it is absolutely blown mine. This one bit of information might just be enough to make me a believer. If you look at the pictures of the shroud, either the positive or the negative, it's pretty easy to see that there's a lot of shading happening in the image. We know we're not dealing with pigments. So let's say you're drawing something with a pencil that requires shading. How would you do that? Well, you would probably apply more pencil lead where you want the picture to be darker and less pencil lead in the lighter areas, right? If you were to transfer that idea to the shroud, that would mean more of this yellowing, aging effects in the darker areas and less in the lighter ones. But that is not what is happening on the shroud. The darker colored areas are not the result of a change in color intensity. Instead, it is the result of a larger or smaller amount of colored or aged fibers per unit area. It's called the halftone effect, and it's the same way newspapers used to print pictures before the days of digital printing. I don't even know how to wrap my head around that one. So what on earth, or maybe beyond Earth, could do something like that? Well, believers and some scientists have a theory. They are speculating that if you follow biblical teachings about the resurrection, perhaps there was a massive particle radiation burst from whatever was lying inside those layers of cloth, changing the very molecular composition of the shroud fibers. This radiation burst would account for many of the unusual features of the cloth, like the fact that only the topmost layers of the yellowed fibers are affected, why the bloodstains still appear so red, the extra carbon-14 molecules that throw off the carbon dating, the fact that the density of the image is the same on both the front and back images, and even the odd proportions of some of the body parts. And scientists have already run experiments where they bombarded a piece of flax linen similar to that of the shroud with protons and were left with a piece of cloth bearing the exact same rapid aging characteristics that are present in the shroud. Or others think maybe it was UV radiation. Tests conducted using UV rays also replicated the same changes to the fibers. One interesting note, the UV testing that was done used a laser pulse that lasted only 1/40 billionth of a second and required billions of watts of power. If you expand those calculations to what would be necessary to imprint the entire shroud, that would require 14,000 lasers operating simultaneously using 34 trillion watts of power. Of course, if this is the true resurrection, I think God would be able to muster all the energy he needs. I am dead serious when I tell you that I honestly don't know where to go with this one. The skeptic in me doesn't want to believe it, and there's certainly plenty of evidence there to support a medieval forgery. But some of these findings are so literally awe-inspiring that I just can't let them go. But no matter what side of the fence you're on, hopefully you at least learned some things you didn't know before. Now, if you're ready for more unexplained weirdness of the divine kind, this is the video for you. Just click it. You won't be disappointed. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the In-Between.